If there are rules around wearing pants, you should probably follow them. But when it comes to writing rules, breaking them is sometimes something that can be beneficial. Today, we're going to discuss 5 seemingly bad story elements. Elements that break well-established patterns and rules, but do so in a way that offer up some intriguing opportunities for the rebellious writer. So buckle up your legally mandated pants and get ready. Here are 5 rule-breaking story elements that might actually work. Starting with the anti-hook. Conventional wisdom usually equates readers to fish, in that they need to be hooked onto the early parts of your story. An intriguing question, a sudden revelation, a character invited to return a piece of jewelry without a receipt. These are all hooks that get a reader invested in a story, an early signal of interest that will make them want to read more. But what if you just don't do that? Enter the anti-hook. Exit the anti-hook? The anti-hook is basically an extremely early twist in a story where you set up some kind of potentially intriguing moment that looks like it's going to be a hook, but it turns out to not be that at all, and it's this sudden rug pulling that makes the reader curious. Maybe your protagonist shows up to wizard school and doesn't actually get in. Maybe the detective shows up to the murder scene to learn that the victim has come back to life. Maybe the meet cute ends with the love interest turning into some cloven-hooved demonic incarnation, who's not really interested in committing to anything serious at this point in time. Now, it could be argued that this is still a hook, that it accomplishes the same thing as a hook, which is an early expression of interest that makes the reader interested in reading the rest of the story. But I think the anti-hook is different because the main strength is the subjugation of expectations. The reader goes into the story expecting to see a normal sort of hook, but the rug is pulled out from under them, and it's the intrigue and the surprise and the violation of expectations of this sudden twist that pulls them into the story. You build up the direction of the story and then quickly veer into something else. This is probably more difficult to pull off than a traditional hook, but it could be something to consider. Speaking of quickly veering into something else, the next rule-breaking story element that we're going to talk about is the hateable protagonist. Generally, readers like to read about characters that they like. The protagonist, or whoever they are rooting for in the story, should be a stand-up sort of person, a bastion of morals and virtue whose striving to make the world a better place inspires the reader to perhaps do the same thing in their own life or whatever. Except when the protagonist isn't like this. The role of protagonist can be filled by a morally gray character, an anti-hero, or a straight-up villain. A high degree of likability is not a necessity when it comes to your main character. And if you pull this off right, a reader can actually get engaged with a character who is less than stellar as a human being. Joe Abercrombie, I think, is the master at making characters that seem virtuous and morally good appear as villains and unlikable, and taking very flawed characters and making them appear as likable. It's a really good example of how you can pull this off and have a protagonist who on the surface seems like the reader wouldn't like. Now there's a fine line that you need to walk here. Just plunking a completely unredeemable asshole into the role of protagonist and expecting the reader to root for them is not going to work. There is a balance between sympathy and revulsion that needs to be attained in order for the hateable protagonist to work. There generally needs to be an underlying good or at least sympathy-inducing element within the character in order for readers to get behind them. Sometimes this comes in the form of them working to defeat a villain who is even worse than they are. Sometimes it's some other kind of sympathetic element. Sometimes it's just the complexity and nuances of how we judge morality that makes a character who appears on the surface as somebody the reader wouldn't root for actually become somebody that a reader would root for. Don't assume that even a very flawed or morally dubious character can't work as a protagonist, because they often do. Next rule-breaking thing that can actually be a good thing. Well, this doesn't make any sense. Confusion. I don't know if I've made this fully clear, but I am a big advocate for clarity in writing. The reader not understanding what's happening or being confused on any level about your story can be a barrier to them getting into a story. It will prevent them from connecting with the plot or the characters if they don't know what's going on. You want there to be questions for sure. You want the reader to be curious and seek out information by continuing to read. But there's a difference between that and confusion. That's true most of the time. There's also a lot of mileage that you can get out of confusing the living daylights out of a reader. This can happen at a very sort of micro level. If an artillery shell lands near your character and they are tossed up into the air among a bunch of dirt and they land funny and their ears are ringing and the guy working behind the counter asks them if they want to order the extra salami, and then they realize that both of the plane's engines have flamed out and the ship is heading directly for an iceberg. Those kind of micro level confusing scenes where something happens and the character is confused and the reader is confused too, those can work to create an interesting effect. Usually, though, we snap back to clarity once the dust settles. But you can also do this at a much broader level where confusion or a lack of information is part of the story. This is a bit harder to pull off, and you need to make sure that you aren't leaving the reader in the dark so much that they just put the book down, but it is possible to do. To do this, you need to engage the reader on a very emotional level. They need to be willing to push past the confusion that the logical parts of their mind is having in order to resolve some kind of emotion that they feel, whether that be curiosity or dread or whatever else. This involves working on a very emotional level, not a logical level. When the reward for untangling the confusion is high enough that the work of untangling it becomes worthwhile, that's when you've hit the sweet spot. Next up, boredom. The last thing you want your novel to be called is boring, unless the plot revolves around drilling a hole to the middle of the earth. But boredom has its place when properly used in storytelling. We don't think of boredom as like a powerful emotional force, but a lot of times it really kind of is. When you get bored, you become extremely motivated to not be bored anymore. Boredom is an uncomfortable feeling, and when you get drawn into something that relieves your boredom, it usually feels pretty good. You should not set out to write a boring story, but having some boring parts, leveraging a reader's natural aversion to boredom, can be helpful because this boredom can create a more marked contrast between the boring parts and the exciting parts of your novel. Good writing leverages peaks and valleys of excitement to keep readers engaged. Giving readers what they want is important, but delaying what you're giving them can build anticipation and make them want it even more. We sometimes think of this delaying as creating tension, as a ramp up in excitement as the reader is on the edge of their seats, waiting to see how something exciting will resolve. But if you think about it, boredom can kind of do the same thing. Having a lack of tension can somewhat paradoxically create more tension, but it's a different kind of tension. Boredom, when properly dispersed through a story and provided it forestalls some kind of exciting element that readers want to experience, that's a really important part. You need boring parts, and you also need something that the reader knows is going to happen that will get them away from the boredom. Doing that can actually make a story better. And the last thing that seems like it wouldn't work, but might actually work if you pull it off correctly, leaving the reader unsatisfied. Speaking of leaving people unsatisfied, we've reached the end of the video. So there you have it. I would love to hear about your favorite rule-breaking things that actually turned out well in the comments down below. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice-related videos and subscribe to my channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.